All we know is that we are going to withdraw by July. So all the Taliban have to do is wait it out. And the Taliban, the Afghans, are very good at waiting it out. They've had several superpowers invade, collapse, and leave. Afghanistan, I don't want to remind you, at the Middle East Institute, is a graveyard of imperial conquerors. To the Afghans, America is just one in a long series. We don't want that. We cannot afford that. We cannot afford it because that is the heart of the great game. Leave a vacuum, it'll be immediately filled up. Look at the northern powers, look at the eastern powers. There's big powers waiting for precisely this to happen. If you don't want that to happen, we better start doing something now. And it all comes back to what's happening over there and the impact with what's happening here. So Wendy, while we're talking about setting up things there, we need to be aware of what's happening here because everything in the age of globalization is being seen and discussed in the Muslim world. The news flashes, the discussion is global. People pick up, if there's a good development in America, if the president goes to a mosque, it has a big impact in the Muslim world, or negative if something negative happens.
If I could ask you to wait for the microphone, and if you could give your name and your affiliation. Right here in the front row.
My name is Ira Weiss.
Ira?
Ira.
I feel terrible about this cool glass of water. I feel like Marie Antoinette drinking while people are saying,
no,
give
please.
them cake, but if you don't mind.
No,
the
not at all.
blazers, you're getting too hot.
No, please do. I have a question. You told the story about the 10-year-old boy and implied that this kind of discrimination and maltreatment of Muslims, particularly as a first generation, usually a Muslim, by their schoolmates and by the rest of society, is going to creates fertile ground for anti-American terrorism on the part of these people. But it seems to me that it's not so different from when I grew up. For example, I'm a first generation Jewish person here. My parents are immigrants, and we routinely got beat up on the way home from school. In fact, we could not wear Jewish kippot and skull caps for fear that we would get beat up on the way home. And then before that, the Irish came, and they were routinely beat up, and no Irish need apply. And yet it did not foment anti-American terrorism on the part of the first-generation Irish community or the first-generation Jewish communities. So why is this different now?
Ira, that's a great question. And again, you will appreciate as an anthropologist, I had to answer this question. So I have an entire chapter on immigrant minorities before the Muslims came, an entire chapter on the Jewish-Muslim relationship. And we go into all this, the Jews coming, and we've got very distinguished Jewish figures in America. Deans and very famous intellectuals being interviewed who say the same thing. They say when we were growing up, we had to run from school because we were being beaten up by our Christian schoolfellows and so on. That was a generation ago. The Irish went through this in the 19th century and so on. It's different right now at this moment. Remember, the relationship between a majority and the minority is always fluid. It's always changing. It's not static. Before 9/11, the Muslims had no problem, unlike the Jews, unlike the Irish who took a century or 2 centuries to really fully be American. The Muslims went straight in. Why? Because they came in, I'm talking about the immigrants, not the African Americans. The immigrants flew in, 60s, 70s, 80s, flew straight into jobs like physicians, doctors, lawyers. No problem. Middle class, big house, cars and so on. We are the part of the American dream. But they were really not on the radar screen. So you may have had a Pakistani doctor or Bangladeshi doctor, but you really didn't know very much about them. 9/11 changed everything. Because there was no background, there was no history, you had no idea who the hell are these people. And suddenly every kind of misrepresentation, every kind of negative idea, and the media was then just pumped in with all this sort of terrorists next door, homegrown terrorists, because there were no studies. I'm telling you, Ira, I am shocked that with my team, we've just conducted a study which may be one of the first studies. May not be, maybe there are 2 or 3 more, I don't know. But if it's the first, I'd be shocked. So that's why most Americans discovered or confronted Islam with this sense of shock. Now, the Muslim community takes blame also, because the leadership, unlike your Jewish leadership, which is really well organized. I do a lot of interfaith in synagogues and so on. You've got rabbis, you've got these community centers, you've got, these are Americans also being organized as Jewish Americans. The Pakistani, Muslims, Arabs, Bangladeshis, Indonesians still have to go through this process. There's some mosques, very often there's a division within the Muslim leadership, very often there's such sharp politics that they negate each other. They're very unclear about the future. They're not sure how to balance being American with being a Muslim. These balances, the Jews have no problem. They're American. If you ask, you say, I'm American. You happen to be Jewish, that's a separate thing. But to the Muslims, there's still that adjustment being made. And at a time like today, after 9/11, you don't have that luxury as a Muslim. That is the crisis. And then you have the crisis overseas. You have wars taking place in 3 or 4 Muslim countries, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, American soldiers being killed there. And these kinds of incidents like this little boy puts it in that context. In that context, you have a simmering crisis. Therefore, and as I said, in our study, we took the whole sweep. So it's not just looking at the Muslims. We've gone through all the communities. And you'll find it's very rich with ethnography, very rich. Wendy, would you supervise the...
Yeah. Dr. Ahmed, I'm David McBride. We met downstairs briefly. I'm a student at Trinity University, and I'm here as part of a multicultural counseling course that I'm taking. I read, as part of the requirements for this course, we read your book, Islam Today, which I think should be required reading in every American high school.
Thank you so much, David. I hope my team heard that, because they're very disrespectful, David. They don't believe this sort of stuff. Please repeat it for them.
Absolutely. The level of ignorance on Islam in the United States is worse than abysmal. It is just, people believe these reports from the press about, fundamentalist Islamic terrorists and, all the extremists. They never learn about what the religion is, where it comes from, its history, its importance in our cultural tradition. My question is, how do we address this in a way that public school teachers and people who run districts education in the United States can make this tradition digestible, understandable, and not, to dispel the ignorance about it? How do we address that?
David, that's a great question, because it really is about knowledge, not so much about Americans knowing. Well, Muslims, I'm sorry to say, David, are exactly in the same situation. You talk to Muslims, as I do. As we traveled, I'd address large Muslim community gatherings, and I'd ask them, I'd say, how many of you have read anything by Benjamin Franklin or Thomas Jefferson, who are great favorites of mine? And it was discouraging, really was discouraging. So the ignorance is on both sides, and that's why it's dangerous. The challenge, as you say, is how do we improve understanding of each other? And here we have an opportunity. There's huge interest in Islam right now. We have the best educational system in the world. We have the best high schools, the best universities. At some level, I know we have to keep the separation of church and state and so on in place, but at some level, we need to make American students aware of the world outside, that there is a world, and it is in our interest to understand that world. And part of that understanding is to understand the cultures of that world. That is how you do it. Because we encountered this as we traveled. Some of the questions we got, David, were shocking. We would be asked, I'd be asked like this in meetings like this. They'd say, why are Muslims worshippers of the moon god? Now, you read my book, you know that there's no mention of the moon god. Maybe that was an omission on my part, but so far I don't know about this moon god. Why do you worship the devil? Why do you worship idols? And questions like this, which simply show that these people really don't know very much about Islam.